On a forsaken winter road, the vampire king reined his black steed so sharply that even his direwolf halted mid-prowl. Because through the howling blizzard, he witnessed something that should not exist in his immortal world. A widow clutching a newborn against the storm. 3 children stumbling behind her, wrapped in rags that offered no defense against winter's fangs. All of them trembling like dying embers, their footprints already vanishing into the snow, and when the cold devoured them like hunger, she didn't beg, she didn't fall, she just kept moving forward, as if death wasn't an end, but a familiar shadow she had learned to outwalk in silence. Then the vampire king dismounted into the storm, his crimson eyes burning through the white, and spoke the words that would bind their fates forever. "Come with me. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if this tale of darkness, sanctuary, and the bonds that defy mortality moves you, subscribe for more stories of courage that blooms in the coldest nights." Your support breathes life into these words. The winter storm carved through the mountain pass like a living blade, wind shrieking across ancient stone as if the earth itself mourned beneath frozen skies. On the narrow forest road, King Valor Draven, immortal sovereign of the Blood Realm, tightened his grip on midnight black reins. His hands, pale as moonlit bone and marked with silver rings of office, moved with the unconscious grace of centuries. The stallion beneath him, a beast bred in shadow with eyes like molten amber, stepped carefully through drifts that would swallow mortal horses whole. The storm pressed close, turning the world into a tunnel of white fury. Beside him rode Sir Aldrin Voss, his most trusted knight, a warrior who had served the crown for 500 years. Aldrin's armor, dark steel etched with protective runes, caught no light in the blizzard. His hand rested always near his sword, trained by endless wars to expect danger in every shadow. At their feet padded the direwolf, massive and black as the space between stars, with eyes that burned like dying coals. The beast's fur rippled with each gust, and its breath rose in ghostly plumes. Valor wasn't traveling toward anything urgent, not in the way mortals understood urgency. He was returning from enforcing a blood tithe in a distant village, a duty as ancient and hollow as the crown he wore. Centuries of power had taught him that immortality bred a particular kind of emptiness, the kind that made even a blizzard feel like a blessed distraction. He'd planned to ride through the storm alone with his thoughts, perhaps stop at the old watchtower where he'd once kept a mortal queen who'd loved him despite what he was. But then the direwolf stopped. Not gradually. Instantly. Its massive head swung left, ears pricked toward something beyond the wind's howling. A low, rumbling growl vibrated through the storm. Valor felt it before he saw it, an unfamiliar pull in his chest, like an invisible thread tugging at something deep inside his immortal heart. His predatory instincts sharpened. He expected bandits, perhaps, or a dying animal. Humans die in these mountains every winter. The storm took them, and the snow buried them, and the world moved on. "My king," Aldrin murmured, voice barely cutting through the wind. Human scent, barely alive. Valor should have ridden on. He'd done it 1,000 times before. But that strange pull intensified and became almost painful. His hand lifted instinctively, and pale witchlight bloomed from his palm, a sphere of ghostly illumination that pushed back the darkness. The light revealed a figure staggering along the road's edge. At first glance, it seemed like a shadow collapsing into snow. Then it moved, and Valor's breath caught, unnecessary though breathing was for him. A woman stumbled into view. She wore a tattered wool coat that had once been deep green but now hung threadbare and soaked. Her hair, the color of autumn oak, clung to her face in frozen strands. Her skin, once fair, had paled to an alarming bluish tint. But it was what she carried that made even the vampire king pause. A newborn infant, bundled against her chest in cloth so thin it might as well have been air. The baby's tiny whimper barely reached through the storm. Behind her, 3 more children struggled through the drifts. A girl of perhaps 9, fiercely gripping a boy of 7. Another small figure, maybe 4 years old, stumbled every few steps, small hands reaching desperately for his mother's coat. The direwolf's growl deepened, not in aggression but in recognition of something profoundly wrong. Mortals, Aldrin said flatly. Lost, likely. Dead by morning. Valor should have agreed. Should have turned away. But that pull in his chest had become a chain, and he found himself dismounting before he'd made the conscious decision to do so. Snow swirled around him but never quite touched his cloak, a subtle manifestation of the power that separated king from subject. He moved forward, each step deliberate, studying the woman with senses honed by 8 centuries of reading prey. She was beyond exhausted. Her body trembled not just from cold, but from the bone-deep fatigue of someone who'd been walking for days. Her arms shook as she held the infant. The children behind her swayed like saplings in the wind. But despite everything, despite the hypothermia claiming them inch by inch, the woman's eyes remained defiant. When she saw him approaching, those eyes widened. Even through the delirium of dying, she recognized what stood before her. The Vampire King. Stories whispered about him in every human settlement from the mountains to the sea. The pale monarch who drank kingdoms dry. The immortal predator whose castle of black stone stood as a monument to darkness. "Stay back," she rasped, voice thin as spider silk. Despite her weakness, she shifted her body between Valor and her children. A mother's instinct overrides survival itself. Valor stopped. His crimson eyes, which had witnessed empires rise and crumble, studied her trembling form. He catalogued everything with predatory precision, the bluish tint on the children's lips, the irregular rhythm of their breathing, the way the infant's cry had grown frighteningly weak. They had perhaps an hour, maybe 2 if fortune favored them. "You will not survive the night," he said. Not cruel. Simple fact delivered in a voice like winter wind given speech. The woman's jaw clenched. Shame flickered across her face, raw and painful. "We have nowhere else," she whispered. Behind Valor, Aldrin shifted in his saddle. "My king, we should." Valor raised one hand, silencing his knight. The storm screamed around them. The direwolf watched with burning eyes. The woman swayed, seconds from collapse, still clutching her baby with desperate strength. For a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, only the wind existed. Only the snow and the darkness, an impossible moment hanging between predator and prey. Then something shifted in Valor's ancient heart. Perhaps it was the way she stood, refusing to beg even as death claimed her. Perhaps it was how fiercely she loved these children, loved them more than her own life. Or perhaps it was something older, something connected to that inexplicable pull in his chest. Valor extended his hand toward her. His gloved palm opened, not in threat but in offer. "Come with me," he said, voice softening in a way that shocked even Aldrin. "Under my word, no harm will touch you, if you accept my protection." The woman stared at his hand as if it might vanish. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Behind her, the older girl, Mira, silently begged with wide, desperate eyes. The boy, Jonas, swayed dangerously. The smallest child, little Rowan, had stopped shivering entirely, a sign more terrifying than trembling. Alara Whitlock, though Valor didn't yet know her name, looked at her children. Then at the monster offering salvation. She nodded once, barely perceptible, a surrender and a leap of faith wrapped into a single gesture. Valor moved with unnatural grace. He lifted Jonas and Rowan with careful hands, placing them on Aldrin's horse despite his knight's bristling disapproval. The direwolf, sensing its master's intent, moved to stand beside Mira, a terrifying yet protective presence. Then Valor turned to Alara. She flinched, but didn't pull away when he carefully lifted her and the infant onto his own stallion. The warmth radiating from the vampire's cloak felt wrong somehow, wrong yet desperately needed. As they began riding through the storm, Alara held her newborn close and watched the silhouette of dark spires emerge from the white. Not a cottage. Not a village. A fortress. Black stone rising like a crown against the storm, ancient and terrifying and impossibly grand. She'd asked her children to trust her. She'd chosen life over death. But as the great iron gates yawned open, torches flaring to life along the walls as if recognizing their king's return, one thought crystallized in Alara's fading consciousness. Have I saved my children, or delivered them to a darkness far worse than freezing? The answer waited beyond those gates, in halls where no living mortal had walked in centuries, where ancient laws forbade what Valor had just done, where something far older than the storm itself was beginning to wake. Behind them, their footprints disappeared into the snow, erased as if they'd never existed at all. The gates closed behind them with a sound like a tomb sealing shut. Alara clutched her newborn tighter as Valor's stallion carried them into the courtyard, her breath catching at what the torchlight revealed. The fortress rose around them in impossible angles, black stone towers climbing toward a sky she could no longer see. Walls carved with symbols that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. Archways tall enough for giants, windows that reflected no light despite the flames dancing along the battlements. The torches themselves were wrong. They burned with silver-white fire that cast no smoke, producing a luminescence that felt cold despite its brightness. The flames bowed as Valor passed, as if the fire itself recognized its king and bent in reverence. Figures emerged from the shadows. Some moved with human hesitation, thralls wrapped in dark wool with eyes that had seen too much and learned not to question. Others glided with predatory grace, lesser vampires whose beauty held a sharp edge, faces too perfect, movements too fluid. They gathered in the courtyard, drawn by curiosity or duty, and their reactions rippled through the cold air like shock waves. A woman with silver-threaded hair pressed her hand to her mouth. A young man, barely older than 20 in appearance, but with eyes ancient as stone, took 3 steps backward. Whispers spread like contagion. Mortals. Children. Under the king's protection? That cannot be. Valor dismounted with fluid grace, then reached up to lift Alara down. Her legs nearly buckled when they touched stones. The world tilted dangerously, exhaustion and cold having carved away most of her strength. But the vampire king's hand steadied her, and she forced herself to stand. Mira pressed close to her mother's side, eyes wide with terror and wonder in equal measure. Jonas clung to Sir Aldrin's cloak, too frightened to let go even as the knight dismounted. Little Rowan simply stared, his small face pale and quiet. The direwolf positioned itself between the children and the gathered vampires, a low rumble vibrating through its massive chest. The message was clear: touch them and die. Prepare chambers in the eastern wing, Valor commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority across the courtyard. Fires burning, warm clothing, food suitable for children. Now. Silence stretched too long. No one moved. Now. Valor repeated, and power laced through the word like iron through silk. The servants scattered. The vampires withdrew more slowly, their eyes lingering on Alara and her children with expressions she couldn't read. Hunger? Curiosity? Contempt? Perhaps all 3 were woven together. This way, Valor said, gesturing toward a massive doorway where silver firelight spilled onto dark stone. Alara followed because there was nowhere else to go. The fortress interior struck her like a physical blow. Her senses, already overwhelmed, struggled to process what surrounded her. The air carried scents that shouldn't coexist: iron and incense, old parchment, and something metallic that might have been blood. Silver fire burned in braziers along the walls, casting dancing shadows that moved independent of the flames. They passed through corridors lined with portraits, and Alara felt eyes following her. She glanced back once, and could have sworn a painted figure's gaze had shifted. She didn't look again. The walls themselves seemed alive, breathing, watching. Tapestries depicted battles between creatures she'd only heard of in stories meant to frighten children. Chandeliers hung from impossibly high ceilings, dripping with crystals that caught the cold light and scattered it like captured stars. They climbed a spiral staircase that seemed to wind upward forever. Jonas stumbled twice. Mira never released Alara's hand. The baby had stopped crying entirely, too exhausted even for tears. Finally, they reached a hallway lined with doors of dark wood bound in silver. Valor pushed one open, revealing chambers that stole what little breath Alara had left. The room was vast, larger than the entire cottage she'd shared with her husband's family. A fireplace dominated one wall, already roaring with natural flame that radiated blessed warmth. Thick carpets covered stone floors. Furniture carved from wood so dark it seemed to absorb light stood arranged throughout. And against the far wall, a bed so large it could hold all 4 children with room to spare. The adjoining chambers connect through that door, Valor said, pointing. Your children will sleep close. Food is being prepared. Clothing will arrive shortly. He paused, studying Alara's trembling form. You are safe here. The words should have comforted her. Instead, they felt like a question she wasn't ready to answer. Before she could respond, Sir Aldrin appeared in the doorway, his expression carved from granite. My king. A word. Valor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. See them settled, he told a young woman who'd arrived carrying an armful of blankets. Then he stepped into the hallway, pulling the door partially closed behind him. But not close enough. Alara, positioning her children near the fire, heard every word through the gap. The bloodhouses will hear of this before dawn, Aldrin said, voice low but urgent. You've broken the covenant. Humans only enter as tribute or thralls, never as protected guests. I'm aware of the law. Valor's tone held an edge cold enough to freeze blood. Then why? Because I choose to. A pause, heavy with unspoken history. She reminds me, he stopped. Started again. There are reasons, Aldrin. Old reasons you know too well. The queen is dead, Valor. 8 centuries dead. Bringing mortals into this fortress won't bring her back. Silence stretched between them, dangerous and deep. Station guards at the eastern wing, Valor finally said, and summon the council for tomorrow night. If they wish to challenge me, they can do so to my face. Footsteps retreated down the hallway. The door opened fully. Valor stood framed in silver darkness, his crimson eyes softer than they'd been in the storm, but still burning with something Alara couldn't name. Rest, he said simply. Then he was gone, the door closing with a whisper of sound. The servants brought food, bread that steamed in the cold air, broth rich with herbs, fruits Alara didn't recognize. They brought clothing, soft wool dresses for Mira, tunics for Jonas, a tiny sleeping gown for the baby that felt like clouds against her fingers. The children ate ravenously, color slowly returning to their faces. Mira asked quiet questions Alara couldn't answer. Jonas watched the direwolf, which had curled itself in the doorway like a living barrier. Rowan fell asleep mid-bite, exhausted beyond measure. Alara should have been relieved. They were warm, federal protected. Instead, memory clawed at her consciousness. 3 weeks ago, her husband's family gathered in the great hall of their manor, faces hard as winter stone. Her mother-in-law's voice, sharp with accusation. The children are cursed. Everyone knows it. Every crop that fails, every sickness that spreads, it began when you bore that first daughter. Now there are 4 of them, and he's dead. You killed him with your cursed womb. Alara had tried to speak, to defend herself, but words died beneath the weight of their conviction. They'd given her until morning to leave. At dawn, they'd thrown her and her children into the snow with nothing but the clothes they wore and a horse blanket. If you're not cursed, her brother-in-law had said, then the storm won't take you. The door had slammed. The lock had turned. And Alara had walked into winter knowing she would die, hoping only that someone might find her children before the cold claimed them too. A sound jerked her back to the present. Voices drifting through the stone walls, too far to distinguish words but close enough to carry tone. Alara moved to the door, pressing her ear against the wood. Down the hallway, around some corners she couldn't see, vampires were speaking. Unprecedented. Mortals burn quickly in games of power. The king risks everything for 3 days, perhaps 4 before. The voices faded, moving away or dropping too low to carry. Alara's hand found the wall, steadying herself. Her children slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, safe and warm and fed. But listening to those whispers, understanding nothing except that they were pieces on a board whose rules she didn't comprehend, Alara finally allowed herself to feel the truth. They'd survived the storm, but the real danger had only just begun. She checked the locks twice before returning to her children, pulling them close as the silver fire danced and the direwolf watched with burning eyes. Guardian or jailer, she still couldn't tell which. Dawn never truly came to the fortress. Instead, the silver fire dimmed to embers, and a gray half-light filtered through windows that seemed designed to resist the sun. Alara woke to find her children already stirring, their fear from the previous night tempered by the resilience only the young possessed. Mira stood at the window, fingers pressed against glass that felt neither warm nor cold. Mama, look. The towers go higher than clouds. Jonas had abandoned his post by the fire to kneel beside the direwolf, which watched him with patient amber eyes. The boy's hand hovered inches from the beast's fur, wanting to touch, but not quite daring. Careful, Alara whispered, though the wolf seemed content to let the child exist in its space. Only Rowan clung to her skirts, small fingers twisted in the fabric, unwilling to explore this strange new world. A knock came soft as breath against the door. Alara tensed, pulling Rowan closer, but the voice that followed carried no threat. "Forgive the intrusion, my lady. I am Helene, the castle healer. His Majesty asked that I see you and the children." My lady. The title felt absurd on Alara's tongue. She'd been cast out like refuse 3 weeks prior. The woman who entered was ancient by mortal standards, perhaps 70 years, with silver hair bound in a practical braid and eyes that held the particular kindness of someone who'd witnessed too much suffering to add to it unnecessarily. She wore simple gray robes, and around her neck hung a pendant that pulsed with faint red light. "The mark of service," Helene said, noting Alara's stare. "I've been bound to King Valor for 43 years. A blood pact, but not the kind you're imagining. He saved my life when I was young and foolish. In return, I serve until my natural death." She smiled, the expression carving deeper lines into her weathered face. "He's been a better master than any mortal lord I knew before." Alara wasn't sure what to say to that. Helene moved through the room with practiced efficiency, checking the children for signs of frostbite or fever. She examined Jonas's fingers, declared them sound. She listened to Myra's chest and pronounced her lungs clear. She cooed over the baby with genuine affection. "You did well keeping them alive," Helene said quietly. 3 days in that storm? Most would have died the first night. I had no choice. Alara's voice emerged rougher than intended. "My husband's family left us no choice at all." Helene's expression shifted, sympathy replacing clinical assessment. "Tell me if you're willing. Sometimes speaking helps." So Alara spoke. About Thomas, her husband, a man of moderate means and immoderate temper. About how his death, falling from his horse while drunk, breaking his neck on frozen ground, had been ruled suspicious by his family. About how they'd blamed her, called her cursed, pointed to every misfortune of the past 5 years as evidence of her witchcraft. "They said each child I bore brought darker luck," Alara whispered, watching Mira trace patterns on the window glass. "That I killed him with cursed blood. They were going to take the children from me, raise them apart, forbid me from ever seeing them again." Her hands trembled. "So I ran. I took them in the night, and I ran, and the storm found us, and the king found you," Helene finished gently. She reached across to squeeze Alara's hand, the touch brief, but grounding. "You're not cursed, child. You're just unlucky in the families you've known. Perhaps that's changing. Alara wanted to believe her, but belief required a kind of hope she'd learned to bury. From his balcony 3 stories above the inner courtyard, Valor watched the mortal woman and her children emerge into the pale morning. The fortress gardens, such as they were, consisted mostly of winter roses that bloomed black and silver and stone paths that wound between frozen fountains. Mira walked ahead, curiosity winning over caution. Jonas trailed the dire wolf, like a devoted shadow. The mother kept Rowan close, her body angled always toward her children, ready to shield them from threats she couldn't see. "You're brooding," Aldrin said, materializing beside him with the silence of 5 centuries' practice. "You've been watching them for an hour." "I'm observing. You're obsessing." The knight's tone held no judgment, only concern worn smooth by long friendship. "What is it about this woman that's rewritten 800 years of precedent?" Valor's jaw tightened. For a long moment, only the wind answered, bitter and cold even against his immortal skin. Then, quietly, he spoke words he'd forbidden himself from uttering for centuries. "She reminds me of Seraphine." Aldrin went still. Even his breathing stopped, an unconscious mimicry of death. "Not in appearance," Valor continued, crimson eyes fixed on Alara below. Seraphine had golden hair, summer sky eyes, a laugh that could make even the damned remember joy. His voice dropped to something raw, something that still bled despite the centuries. "But the way this woman stands, protecting what she loves despite impossible odds, refusing to beg even when death circles close, that is Seraphine. My king. My own council killed her," Valor said, the words emerging like shards of glass. "Poison her for the crime of being human in my bed, for daring to influence policy, to suggest that mortals deserved better than to be cattle. They called it mercy, saving me from the weakness of love." His hands gripped the balcony rail hard enough that stone cracked beneath his fingers. "I slaughtered half my court that night, banned humans from ever entering these halls except as bound thralls who could never rise above their station. I thought if I couldn't save her, I could at least prevent myself from caring again. Then why break that law now?" Valor finally turned to face his oldest friend. "Because when I saw that woman in the storm, I felt something I thought had died with Seraphine. And I'm damned if I know whether that makes me hopeful or terrified." Aldrin studied him with eyes that had witnessed the worst night of Valor's existence. "The Council will not accept this easily. They'll remember what happened last time you loved a mortal." "Let them remember," Valor said, voice hardening back into the tone of an immortal king. "And let them try to stop me." That evening, as silver fire cast dancing shadows across the chamber walls, Alara prepared to change the baby's clothes. She unwrapped the tiny form carefully, grateful for the warmth that finally allowed her to tend her infant properly. The fabric fell away from small wrists. And there, on the baby's left wrist, a mark glimmered. Alara froze. The mark hadn't been there before, or had it? Had she simply been too desperate, too focused on survival to notice? It shimmered like moonlight trapped beneath skin, shaped like a crescent moon wrapped around a blooming rose, intricate as jewelry, impossible as magic. The door opened without sound. Valor stood in the entrance, and whatever words he'd come to speak died unspoken. His crimson eyes locked onto the baby's wrist. Color drained from his already pale face. For the first time since Alara had met him, the vampire king looked genuinely shaken. Sir Aldrin appeared behind him, hand flying instinctively to his sword. "That mark." "The Queen's crest," Valor whispered. He moved forward as if pulled by invisible strings, stopping at the edge of the firelight. 800 years. It's been 800 years since I've seen that sigil. Alara clutched her baby closer, protective instinct overriding everything else. "What does it mean?" Valor's gaze lifted to hers, and in his ancient eyes she saw pain sharp enough to cut. "It means your child carries the bloodline of my lost queen. A line I thought destroyed. erased from history by those who feared what it represented. He straightened, composure returning like armor sliding back into place. It means nothing about your rescue was accident or mercy. Fate, Aldrin breathed, and the word carried the weight of prophecy. What bloodline? Alara demanded, though her voice shook. My husband's family were merchants, minor nobility at best. I'm nobody. Your husband's line, perhaps, Baylor said. But what of your mother's line? Your grandmother's? Blood remembers what names forget. Alara's mind raced backward through fragmentary family stories, whispers of a great-great-grandmother who disappeared into the mountains, tales dismissed as myth meant to add mystery to an otherwise unremarkable lineage. The prophecy, Aldrin said quietly, and Vaylor's expression darkened further. Not yet, the king said. She's not ready. She needs to understand what she's carrying. Aldrin's tone held the firmness of a man who'd seen kingdoms fall from ignorance. That mark makes the child invaluable. It also makes her a target. Alara's arms tightened around her baby until the infant squirmed. A target for what? Vaylor met her gaze, and in that moment, she saw the truth he'd been holding back. For those who would use your child to overthrow me. For those who would sacrifice her to fulfill an ancient prophecy. For those who simply want to ensure that prophecy never comes to pass. He paused. Your daughter is no longer just your daughter. She's a key to a future that powerful beings have been waiting centuries to either unlock or destroy. The silver fire crackled. The dire wolf growled low from its post at the door. And Alara realized with crystalline clarity that the storm had been the least dangerous thing they'd faced. She'd thought she was saving her children from winter's teeth. Instead, she delivered them into the jaws of something far more ancient, far more hungry, and infinitely more patient. What have I done? She whispered. Vaylor's expression softened fractionally. You've survived. The rest we'll face together. But his words, meant as comfort, felt like the promise of war. The council hall existed in the fortress's black heart, a chamber carved from obsidian that seemed to drink light rather than reflect it. Vaylor stood at the head of a table long enough to seat 30, his pale hands resting on dark stone as nobles filtered in through doors that opened like wounds. They came draped in silks the color of old blood and midnight, in armor etched with sigils of their ancient houses. Some wore their age openly, faces lined by centuries, eyes holding the weight of empires. Others had frozen in youth's perfection, beautiful as carved statues and twice as cold. But all of them shared the same predatory grace, the same hunger burning behind careful courtesy. Lord Casimir Thorne arrived last, as was his custom, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver hair pulled back from a face that might have been handsome if not for the cruelty threading through every feature. He commanded the Western Bloodhouse, held territories that rivaled Vaylor's own, and had opposed every progressive decree the king had issued for the past 3 centuries. My king, he said, the title emerging with just enough respect to avoid outright insult. You've called us on short notice. I've called you because the matter cannot wait. Vaylor's crimson eyes swept the assembled nobles. 3 nights ago, I granted sanctuary to a mortal woman and her 4 children. They reside now in the eastern wing under my personal protection. Silence crashed through the hall like a physical thing. Then chaos erupted. Mortals? Lady Morvanna hissed, her porcelain features twisting. Living freely in these halls? The covenant forbids. Ancient law states clearly, only as tribute or thralls. Vaylor's palms struck the table. The sound cracked like thunder, and the obsidian beneath his hand spiderwebbed with fractures. Silence returned, sharp-edged and sullen. I am aware of the law, Vaylor said, voice dropping to something deadly. I wrote half of it, and I am telling you now that Alara Whitlock and her children are under my protection. No feeding, no compulsion, no harm. Anyone who violates this will answer to me personally. Lord Casimir leaned back in his chair, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. How curious. 8 centuries of precedent, shattered for a random mortal stumbled upon in a storm. His gaze sharpened. Unless she's not random at all. Rumor speaks of a marked child, a prophetic sign conveniently discovered. Carefully, Casimir. Sir Aldrin's voice cut across the table, his hand resting on his sword hilt. I speak only of concern for our king's well-being. Casimir spread his hands in mock innocence. After all, such marks can be forged. Mortal desperation breeds elaborate deceptions. Perhaps this woman, knowing our king's tragic history, used her children to manipulate his sympathies. Valor moved so quickly that even the vampires barely tracked it. One moment he stood at the table's head. The next, his hand gripped Casimir's throat, lifting the lord from his chair with casual, terrifying strength. Question my judgment again, Valor whispered, and you'll learn how quickly sympathy becomes wrath. He released Casimir, who fell back gasping unnecessarily, a performance of vulnerability meant to sway the watching nobles. The mark is genuine, Valor continued, returning to his position. The child carries the queen's crest. What that means for the prophecy, for this realm, remains to be seen. But she and her family will be protected while we determine the truth. At what cost? Another noble asked. The mortal kingdoms already fear us. Harboring their citizens without tribute will be seen as weakness. Let them see what they wish, Valor said coldly. This discussion is over. The woman and her children stay. Adjust your expectations accordingly. He strode from the hall, leaving whispers and barely contained fury in his wake. Sir Aldrin caught him in the corridor beyond, away from listening ears. That was reckless. The knight's tone held the particular exasperation of someone who'd watched his king make dangerous decisions for 500 years. You've given Casimir exactly what he wanted, public evidence of your attachment to these mortals. I won't pretend otherwise. Valor kept walking, boots silent on stone. The child bears the crest. Hiding that truth would only delay the inevitable conflict. The council is fractured. Half want to study the child. A quarter want her dead. The rest simply want you to enforce the old laws. Aldrin moved to block his path. We tread on ice thinner than what covered that road where you found her. Then we tread carefully, Valor said, though his expression suggested he'd already accepted that the ice would break. Double the guards on the eastern wing. And watch Casimir. He's planning something. He's always planning something. This time feels different. Alara knew nothing of the council's fury. She spent her days trying to prove her worth in whatever small ways the fortress allowed. She mended torn linens in the servants' quarters, her stitching neat despite trembling hands. She helped calm a human thrall who dropped a tray, the girl's terror of punishment easing under Alara's gentle reassurance. You're kind, the thrall whispered. Most nobles don't see us at all. I'm not noble, Alara replied. I'm just trying to survive. Mira had found an unexpected friendship with a young guard named Marcus, who'd taken pity on the fierce child and begun teaching her basic defensive stances in an empty training room. Jonas spent his hours trailing the dire wolf through secret passages, discovering rooms that hadn't seen living feet in decades. Only Rowan remained always at Alara's side, the marked child quiet and watchful beyond her months. Late one evening, carrying fresh linens through a corridor near the council chamber, Alara heard voices rising through a ventilation grate. King risks everything for a mortal smile. Prophecy or not, she's a liability. Remember what happened to the last human he loved. This ends in blood, mark my words. Alara's hands tightened on the linens. She'd suspected the danger, but hearing it confirmed, hearing the casual certainty with which they discussed violence, made her stomach turn to ice. Valor hadn't just saved them. He'd positioned himself between them and an entire court of immortal predators hungry for any sign of weakness. She was still standing frozen in the hallway when the massive raven landed on the window ledge beside her. Its eyes gleamed with intelligence too sharp for any natural bird. A scroll bound in red ribbon clutched in its talons. The raven cawed once, harsh and mocking, then launched itself back into the night. Alara watched it disappear into darkness, and though she couldn't read the message it carried, she understood its meaning well enough. The storm outside the fortress was gathering, and this time, no vampire king could stand between them and what was coming. The whispers spread like poison through the fortress veins. The blizzard woman carries a child marked by fate. The prophecy child, hidden in plain sight, worth a fortune to the right buyer. Alara felt the change before she understood it. Human servants who'd once offered tentative smiles now averted their eyes, hurrying past as if proximity alone might curse them. The thrall girl she'd comforted no longer appeared in the eastern wing. Even Helene's visits grew brief, nervous glances replacing comfortable conversation. The vampires were worse. Some watched with hunger that had nothing to do with blood. Others with cold calculation, appraising Rowan the way merchants assessed valuable livestock. A young noble cornered Mira in a hallway, fangs bared in cruel amusement, asking if mortal children tasted sweeter when frightened. Only Marcus's arrival had sent him laughing into shadow. Alara held her family closer, venturing from their chambers only when necessary. On the fifth night, Valor appeared at her door carrying a small wooden box. Inside, nestled in velvet, lay a pendant, a silver crescent moon wrapped around a crystal rose, the same symbol that marked Rowan's wrist. "Wear this," he said, fastening it around her neck before she could protest. His fingers brushed her collarbone, cold yet somehow gentle. "It wards against compulsion. No vampire can bend your will while you wear it." "Why would I need?" "Because I cannot watch you every moment." His crimson eyes held hers. "And there are those in this court who would rather see you gone than see me protect you." The pendant settled against her skin, thrumming with faint warmth. This belonged to her. "Your queen." It wasn't a question. Valor's expression confirmed it. "Keep it close," he said. "I must negotiate with Lord Brennan tonight. A territorial dispute that cannot wait. Aldrin will patrol the corridors, and the wolf remains at your door." He hesitated, vulnerability flickering across immortal features. "I would not go if the matter weren't urgent." "We'll be fine," Alara lied. Midnight came soft as silk and deadly as drawn steel. Alara woke to wrongness, a prickling at the base of her skull, the pendant suddenly burning hot against her chest. She rose from bed where she'd fallen asleep beside her children, all four tucked together like a litter seeking warmth. The direwolf wasn't at the door. Her heart hammered. The beast never left its post. Never. Then she saw the shadow moving near the window. Not one shadow. 3. They moved like liquid darkness, vampires whose skill at stealth spoke of assassin training. 2 males, 1 female. All young in appearance, but with eyes ancient as tombs. The female held a cloth that reeked of something chemical. The larger male carried rope. The third withdrew a dagger that gleamed with sickly green phosphorescence. Poison. For a baby who couldn't fight back. Alara's scream tore through the chamber. "Mira. Jonas. Run." The children jerked awake. Mira, bless her brave heart, grabbed Jonas and little Rowan and ran for the adjoining room, slamming the door behind them. The assassins moved, but Alara moved first. She seized the iron poker from the fireplace, swinging it with desperate strength. The metal connected with the female vampire's skull with a crack that reverberated through Alara's bones. The vampire staggered, more surprised than hurt, but it bought seconds. Seconds Alara used to grab a handful of hot coals from the hearth and fling them at the nearest attacker. He shrieked, a sound too high for human ears, as embers burned through expensive silk into cold flesh. Vampires might be immortal, but fire still bites. The third assassin lunged for the adjoining door. Alara threw herself between him and her children, taking a backhanded blow that sent her crashing into furniture. Wood splintered. Pain exploded through her ribs. She grabbed a broken chair leg, jagged end sharp as any stake, and drove it upward as the vampire descended upon her. The wood punched through his shoulder. Not the heart she'd missed, but deep enough to pin him momentarily to the wooden wardrobe behind her. His roar of pain shattered the night. Then the dire wolf burst through the door, an avalanche of fur and fangs. It took the female vampire by the throat, shaking her like a rag doll. Behind the beast came Sir Aldrin, sword drawn and singing death as it cut through shadow. The male Alara had wrenched himself free from the chair leg, blood black as ink streaming from a shoulder. He lunged for the adjoining room one final time, desperation overriding survival instinct. The door flew open. Rowan stood in Myra's arms, and the mark on the baby's wrist blazed like captured starlight. The vampire froze mid-leap. His expression twisted from fury to agony to something approaching religious ecstasy. He reached for the child with trembling hands, utterly transfixed, vulnerable. Aldrin's sword took his head. The other two assassins died quickly after, the dire wolf and night moving with practiced efficiency born of centuries fighting together. Silence fell heavy with the scent of blood and smoke. Alara collapsed against the wall, chest heaving, the broken chair leg still clutched in her white-knuckled grip. Aldrin stared at her, something like respect flickering through his perpetual wariness. "You wounded one," he said quietly. "A mortal woman with no training, and you wounded a trained assassin." "I'm a mother," Alara rasped. "That's all the training I need." Mira and Jonas emerged from the adjoining room, faces pale, eyes too wide. They'd seen violence now, seen death. Another innocence stolen. Rowan's mark had dimmed to a faint shimmer, and the baby slept peacefully, unaware she'd just driven a vampire to his death with nothing but inherited magic. Valor returned with dawn's approach. Alara heard him before she saw him, the sharp crack of his voice echoing through corridors, rage given immortal resonance. He appeared in the doorway, took in the scene with a single sweep. Bodies being dragged away by guards, Alara bruised and bleeding, his children shaking but alive. Who sent them? His voice could have frozen hell itself. "House Thorn," Aldrin reported. The female bore Casimir's mark. Valor's expression went absolutely still. Then he turned and strode from the room, purpose radiating from every line of his body. An hour later, the fortress shook with thunder that had nothing to do with weather. Screams echoed through the stone. When Valor returned, ashes clung to his coat, and his eyes burned with fires that hadn't quite banked. "It's done," he said simply. That night, Alara found him alone on a balcony, overlooking the mountains. Snow fell soft as secrets. She wore a borrowed cloak over her bandaged ribs, the pendant still warm against her bruised chest. "Why?" she demanded without preamble. "Why is my daughter worth dying over? Worth executing nobles? Worth shattering your own laws?" Valor stared into darkness for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 8 centuries. "Because a prophecy written before I was born speaks of a child marked with the Queen's crest. A child born of a mortal woman who will either unite the vampire and human realms in lasting peace, or destroy both in fire that consumes everything." He turned to face her. "Your daughter might be the key to ending centuries of bloodshed, or she might be the spark that burns the world to ash." Alara's legs weakened. She gripped the balcony rail. "You're saying my baby is the fulcrum upon which history will turn," Valor finished. "And every power in this realm will fight to control which way it tips." The snow fell. The night pressed close. And Alara understood with terrible clarity that she'd never escape this fortress, never find safety, never protect her children by running. The only path forward was through. "Then teach me," she said. "Teach me to fight. Teach me your politics. Teach me everything I need to survive in your world." Valor studied her with something that might have been admiration. "That training won't be gentle." "Nothing about survival ever is," Alara replied. His lips curved, not quite a smile, but close. "Tomorrow, then, we begin." The library existed in a place Alara hadn't known was possible, deep within the mountain itself, carved from living rock over centuries of patient work. Valor led her through passages that twisted like veins, down stairs that seemed to descend into the earth's cold heart, until finally they emerged into a chamber that stole her breath. Crystal lamps hung from the ceiling like frozen stars, casting pale light across walls lined floor to ceiling with books, scrolls, and tablets inscribed in languages dead before her ancestors were born. The air tasted of old parchment and older magic, and the silence held the particular weight of accumulated knowledge. "Few know this place exists," Valor said, moving toward a glass case in the chamber's center. "The prophecies kept here are too dangerous for common eyes." Inside the case lay a scroll so ancient the parchment had yellowed to the color of old bone. Symbols crawled across its surface, some recognizable as archaic script, others purely decorative, or perhaps magical. Valor's hands, steady when wielding sword or crown, trembled slightly as he lifted the scroll. "The prophecy of the silver flame," he said quietly. "Written by an oracle 3,000 years ago, before vampires even had kingdoms, when we were still young enough to fear what we might become." He unrolled it carefully. The symbols seemed to shimmer in the crystal light, and Alara felt the pendant at her throat grow warm. "When winter yields to ash and snow runs red with old betrayal's cost," Valor read, "a mortal woman marked by ancient blood shall bear the child who carries dawn. The silver flame shall burn in small hands, neither living nor dead, neither human nor immortal, but bridge between the sundered realms." He paused, crimson eyes finding hers. "This child shall either forge the peace that ends eternal night, binding vampire and human in covenant unbreakable, or shall become the pyre upon which both races burn, leaving nothing but silence where kingdoms stood." The words hung in the air like a sentence yet to be carried out. "My daughter," Alara whispered. "You're saying my daughter is this bridge?" "The mark proves it." Valor set the scroll down with reverent care. The queen's crest was the oracle symbol. It appeared on the wrist of Seraphine, my queen, my love, the day she was born. The prophecy said her bloodline would carry the flame forward, generation to generation, until the marked child finally came. He moved to the window, a narrow opening that looked out over mountains shrouded in perpetual twilight. "Seraphine and I ruled together for 10 years. She was brilliant, fierce, determined to prove that humans and vampires could coexist as equals. She pushed for laws protecting human rights, for limiting blood tides, for education and representation." His voice roughened. "My council called it sedition, called her a corrupting influence. They poisoned her slowly over months, disguising it as illness, so I wouldn't suspect until too late. Valor. When she died, I thought her line died with her. She bore no children, we'd hoped, but," he stopped, pain etching lines even immortality couldn't erase. "I forbade humans from court after that. Told myself it was to prevent another tragedy. Really, I was just terrified of caring again." Alara approached slowly, seeing him not as the terrifying vampire king but as a man carrying 8 centuries of grief. "You loved her." "I love her still," he said simply. "Death doesn't end love. It just transforms it into something you carry forever." He turned to face Alara. "When I saw you in that storm, clutching your children, refusing to beg even as death circled, I saw her. Saw her strength in you. And when I saw that mark on your daughter's wrist, I knew. Seraphine's line survived. It survived, and it led to you." "My family never spoke of noble blood," Alara said slowly, mind racing through fragmentary memories. "But my grandmother's mother, there were stories. She disappeared when she was young, ran from some great family. People whispered she'd been promised to a monster, that she would flee rather than marry him. She fled the court," Valor said. "After Seraphine's death, her relatives were hunted. Some killed, some driven out. Your ancestor must have hidden her heritage, buried it so deep that even her children forgot." His expression softened. "The curse they blamed you for, it was never a curse. It was the prophecy's magic, marking your bloodline. waiting for the right moment to emerge. Tears burned Alara's eyes. All those years of blame, of shame, of being called witch and murderer, and it had been destiny all along. "I don't want destiny," she whispered. "I just want my children safe." Sometimes those are the same thing. Valor stepped closer, and the space between them felt charged with something neither could name. "You've already proven stronger than most give you credit for. You wounded a trained assassin. You stood between death and your children without hesitation. That strength, it's what Seraphine had. What the prophecy requires." Their eyes held, and Alara saw in his gaze something she recognized because she felt it too, the fragile beginning of trust, the dangerous seed of attraction growing in the worst possible soil. The moment broke when Sir Aldrin appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. "Forgive the interruption," he said, "but I need a word with Lady Alara. Privately." They stood in an adjacent chamber, Aldrin's weathered face illuminated by cold crystal light. "You should know," he said without preamble, "that prophecy has never been kind to those it touches. I served Seraphine. I failed to protect her. I watched the king nearly destroy himself with grief." His hand rested on his sword hilt, an unconscious gesture. "That prophecy, hanging over your daughter, will bring nothing but blood and fire." "Then I'll learn to fight fire with fire," Alara said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. Aldrin studied her, seeing something that made him nod slowly. "You're not running." "Where would I run? You said it yourself. They'll hunt us to the ends of the earth." She straightened, decision settling into her bones like ice hardening into unbreakable crystal. "If destiny wants my daughter, it will have to go through me. So teach me. Teach me to fight. Teach me your politics. Teach me how to survive in this world of fangs and ancient grudges." Something like respect flickered through Aldrin's expression. "It won't be gentle." "Nothing about my life has been gentle." The training began the next day. In the mornings, Aldrin drilled her in basic combat, how to hold a blade, where to strike to slow a vampire if not kill them, and how to use her smaller size as advantage rather than weakness. Her muscles screamed. Bruises bloomed like dark flowers across her skin. But she didn't quit. In the afternoons, Valor taught her court politics, which houses held power, who owed debts to whom, the intricate dance of alliance and betrayal that governed vampire society. She learned to read faces that had perfected deception over centuries. In the evenings, she studied with Helene, learning about vampire physiology, their strengths and weaknesses, the laws written in blood that governed their world. And at night, alone in her chambers, Alara practiced with a pendant. She'd noticed it responded to her touch, growing warmer, sometimes pulsing with faint light. When she concentrated, focused her will through it, she could feel something stir, power that had been sleeping in her blood, waiting for the right catalyst to wake. Magic, real magic, flowing through her veins from an ancestor she'd never known. The widow who'd been cast into snow to die was transforming into something else entirely. Something that might actually survive what was coming. 3 weeks of training transformed Alara from prey into something harder to define. She moved through the fortress with new confidence, had high despite the stairs. Some courtiers had begun nodding to her in corridors, grudging acknowledgement of someone who refused to break. Others watched with hatred barely concealed behind courtly masks, despising how the mortal widow had wormed her way into their king's regard. Lord Casimir Thorne watched most carefully of all. In the shadows of his private chambers, he gathered the discontented like a spider collecting flies. Lord Brennan, who'd lost territory in Valor's latest decree. Lady Morvanna, still bitter about the ancient laws being bent. Others whose grievances stretched back centuries, old wounds that had festered into something poisonous. "The king grows weak," Casimir said, voice smooth as poisoned honey. "He risks our entire realm for a mortal smile and a prophecy that may be nothing more than children's tales." "The child bears the mark," Brennan argued. "The prophecy." "The prophecy speaks of ending war or causing destruction," Casimir interrupted. Either way, such power cannot remain in Valor's hands alone. The child should be held by the council, studied and controlled. He paused, letting the words sink in. For the good of all vampire kind. But he'd already sent messages beyond the fortress walls to rival bloodhouses who'd long envied Valor's power, who'd pay fortunes for a prophesied child, who'd support a new king if Valor fell. The conspiracy grew in darkness, roots spreading like rot through the court. Sir Aldrin sensed the betrayal before he could prove it. 5 centuries of warfare had honed his instincts for treachery. He followed whispers, investigated strange absences, watched who spoke with whom in shadowed corners. He suspected Lord Brennan. The man had been too vocal in his opposition, too obvious in his contempt. Aldrin had him watched, guards noting his every movement. He never suspected Councillor Meredith, the ancient vampire who'd served 3 kings before Valor, whose loyalty was supposed to be absolute. That was his first mistake. Mira discovered the truth by accident. She'd been exploring again, those servant passages Jonas had shown her, narrow corridors built for humans to move unseen through vampire halls. She'd turned it into a game, seeing how far she could go before getting caught. She was crouched behind a grating when the voices drifted up from the chamber below. During the assembly, when all are gathered, the wards in the eastern wing must fall first. Mortal blood spilled in the throne room will send the message. The child taken, the king deposed, and we claim what should have been ours centuries ago. Myra's heart hammered so hard she feared they'd hear it. She recognized one voice, Councillor Meredith, who'd smiled kindly at her just yesterday. She ran. Alara listened to her daughter's breathless report with growing horror. She pieced it together with fragments she'd overheard, with the looks exchanged between certain nobles, with Aldrin's increasing tension. There's going to be an attack, she told Valor that evening. During the next assembly, they planned to take Rowan. Valor stood at his window, watching snow fall across dark mountains. I know there's unrest. Casimir's ambition isn't subtle, but an open attack. He shook his head. They fear me too much. Whatever plot exists, it will be indirect, sabotage rather than confrontation. You're underestimating them. I've ruled for 8 centuries. His tone held the particular arrogance of immortality. I know my court, but Alara saw what he couldn't or wouldn't. That love, even the memory of love, made one vulnerable. That protecting her and her children had painted targets on all their backs. That sometimes the monsters you'd caged grew patient enough to pick their locks. She went to find Aldrin. The assembly was called for the winter solstice, a gathering of every noble house to discuss treaties and tithes. The throne room was filled with silk and steel, with courtiers whose beauty masked hunger centuries old. Alara stood near Valor's throne, wearing a dress of deep burgundy that Helene had insisted upon. The pendant hung at her throat, pulsing with barely contained warmth. She'd hidden a silver dagger in her skirts, Aldrin's gift, blessed against the undead. Mira had taken Jonas and Rowan to the underground passages with Marcus and the direwolf as guards. Alara had held her baby one last time, memorizing the weight of her, before sending her to safety. Or what passed for safety in a fortress built on blood. The assembly proceeded with formal tedium. Trade agreements. Territorial disputes. The kind of politics that took hours to accomplish nothing. Then Councillor Meredith stood to speak. My king, he said, voice carrying false respect. I must raise concern about the mortal woman and her marked child. The prophecy speaks of destruction as easily as peace. Surely, for the good of the realm, the child should be held in protective custody by the full council, not by. He never finished. The throne room's great doors exploded inward. Vampires poured through, not courtiers but warriors, armed and armored, their eyes burning with bloodlust. The defensive wards that should have kept them out had failed, disabled by someone with intimate knowledge of the fortress's protections. By Meredith, who now stepped away from Valor with a smile like a blade. Lord Casimir entered at the head of the rebel force, magnificent in black armor etched with his house sigil. Behind him came nobles from external bloodhouses, vampires who'd been banned from these halls for crimes against the crown. Valor Draven, Casimir announced, voice ringing through chaos. Your reign ends tonight. Surrender the mortal and her marked child, and we may yet show mercy. Valor rose from his throne, and power rolled off him in waves that made even the rebels hesitate. His crimson eyes burned like captured hellfire. You dare? We dare because you've grown weak, Casimir replied. Because you've broken every law from mortal smile. Because the prophecy child belongs to all of us, not to your sentimental attachment to a ghost 8 centuries dead. Sir Aldrin's sword rang free, positioning himself at Valor's right. Loyal guards closed ranks, but half the court stood frozen, unwilling to commit to either side, waiting to see which king would still be standing when dawn came. Alara's hand found the dagger's hilt. She'd trained for 3 weeks. 3 weeks against vampires who'd trained for centuries. But she'd survived a blizzard, survived assassination, survived being called cursed and worthless and disposable. She wasn't running now. Come then, Valor said, voice dropping to something ancient and terrifying. Learn why they call me king.
Steel sang.
Fangs flashed, and the Blood Court rebellion began with a roar that shook stone foundations. The throne room became a storm of fangs and steel. Vampires moved too fast for mortal eyes to track, blurring between shadow and substance. Swords clashed with sounds like breaking crystals. Blood, black as ink and red as wine, splattered across obsidian floors. The silver fire chandeliers swung wildly, casting mad shadows that danced with the violence below. Valor fought like winter-given teeth. His blade moved in arcs of silver light, each strike precise, each movement economical despite the fury behind it. He took a sword through the shoulder and barely flinched, ripping the blade free and using it to decapitate its wielder. A rebel's claws raked across his face, drawing black blood, but Valor's answering blow shattered the vampire's spine. But there were too many. For every rebel that fell, 2 more pressed forward. Sir Aldrin dueled Counselor Meredith near the shattered doors. Old comrades turned enemies. Their blades sang a song of betrayal. You trained me, Aldrin snarled, blocking a strike that would have taken his head. I trained you to serve the realm, Meredith countered, not a lovesick fool who breaks centuries of law for mortal flesh. Their swords locked, faces inches apart. You don't understand what she represents. I understand prophecy, Meredith hissed. And I understand that a child is too dangerous to leave in anyone's hands. Aldrin twisted, redirecting Meredith's momentum, and drove his blade through the counselor's heart. Then you understand nothing. Meredith crumbled to ash, his centuries of service ending in dust and treachery. Across the throne room, Lord Casimir had reached his true objective. Marcus lay unconscious, bleeding from a head wound. The direwolf's jaws were clamped around a rebel's throat, but 3 more vampires pinned the beast with enchanted chains. And in the center of a hastily drawn ritual circle, Mira stood frozen by compulsion, holding baby Rowan. No! Alara's scream cut through the chaos. She ran, stumbling over bodies, her training forgotten in the terror of seeing her children in danger. Casimir smiled, fangs gleaming. The prophecy speaks of a marked child's blood-ending war. It doesn't specify which side wins. He raised a ceremonial dagger, its blade inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at. Her sacrifice will grant me power over all bloodhouses. I'll unite the vampire realms under one true king. Rowan's mark blazed like a captured star, and the baby wailed, a sound of pure terror that shouldn't exist in one so young. The light from her wrist lanced outward. Vampires closest to the circle stumbled back, faces twisted in agony as prophecy's magic seared them like holy fire. But Casimir had prepared for this. His ritual circle drank the light, channeling it, containing it, preparing to corrupt it for his purposes. Alara reached the circle's edge just as the dagger began its descent. She threw herself between steel and child, knowing she'd die, knowing it wouldn't matter because her body would only delay the inevitable by seconds. But the pendant at her throat had other ideas. It erupted with light, pure, searing, silver as the moon and bright as the sun vampires hadn't seen in millennia. The light answered something deep in Alara's blood, the heritage she'd never known she carried, the magic sleeping in Seraphine's line that had waited 8 centuries for this exact moment. Alara didn't think. She simply wanted her children safe, wanted the evil surrounding them destroyed, wanted the strength to protect what she loved. The pendant listened. Power flooded through her in a torrent that should have killed her, but instead felt like coming home. She thrust her hands outward, and the light obeyed, expanding in a ring of lunar fire that consumed Casimir's ritual circle like parchment in a furnace. The dark magic shattered. The symbols burned away, and every rebel within 20 feet was driven to their knees, screaming as light scoured through them. Myra's compulsion broke. She clutched Rowan and ran, ducking behind an overturned table. Casimir staggered backward, his centuries of preparation destroyed in heartbeats. His eyes met Alara's, and for the first time, she saw fear in them. Impossible, he breathed. The bloodline was dead. Clearly, Alara said, voice ringing with power that made even her throat vibrate strangely. You were misinformed. Valor appeared beside Casimir like death materializing from shadow. Blood covered the vampire king, his own and others, but his crimson eyes burned with savage satisfaction. You wanted to teach me about weakness? Valor's hand closed around Casimir's throat. Let me teach you about consequences. What happened next was brutal, efficient. A king reminding his subjects why they'd fear him for 8 centuries. When Valor finally released Casimir, the Lord crumpled to ash, his centuries of scheming ending in the same throne room where he'd plotted rebellion. Silence fell like a curtain. The remaining rebels knelt, weapons dropped, eyes averted in submission. Some wept black tears. Others simply trembled, waiting for judgment. Valor stood at the center of carnage, breathing unnecessarily hard, looking every inch the immortal predator legends warned about. But when his eyes found Alara, something in his expression softened. She stood where the ritual circle had been, the pendant still glowing faintly against her chest, her borrowed dress torn and blood-stained, her hair wild around her shoulders. She looked nothing like the terrified widow he'd found freezing in a blizzard. She looked like a queen who'd fought for her throne and won. It's over, he said, voice carrying to every corner of the throne room. Alara held his gaze. No, it's just beginning. Because everyone in that hall had seen what she did. Had seen mortal woman channel power that shouldn't exist, wielding magic from a bloodline 8 centuries dead. Had seen her stand between prophecy and those who'd abuse it, fearless despite every reason to be afraid. The whispers would spread by morning. The Blizzard woman wasn't just carrying a marked child. She marked herself. Chosen. Dangerous. And standing beside the vampire king as if she belonged there. Sir Aldrin approached, limping slightly, and knelt before Valor in the old gesture of fealty. One by one, the loyalists followed. Then, slowly, the defeated rebels. All except one elderly noble who studied Alara with something approaching wonder. The queen returns, she whispered. After 800 years, Seraphine's line returns to the throne. Alara met Valor's eyes across the blood-stained floor. Neither confirmed nor denied. But they both knew that widow and king had just become something far more complicated. Something that would reshape their world whether they wanted it to or not. The fortress changed in the rebellion's aftermath, subtle as seasons turned, but just as inevitable. Traitors who'd survived faced Valor's judgment. Some were executed, their ashes scattered to the winter winds. Others were exiled, forbidden from returning on pain of true death. A few, who'd been compelled or deceived, were shown mercy that surprised even them. New oaths were sworn in the throne room, blood pacts sealed with ritual as old as vampire memory. The council was reformed, smaller now, composed only of those who'd proven loyalty when it cost them everything. And throughout the fortress, humans noticed differences. A thrall dropped a tray of glasses in the great hall and braced for punishment, but the nobles simply waved her away, more concerned with avoiding the shards than inflicting pain. Human servants received warmer clothing, better quarters, acknowledgement that they were more than ambulatory livestock. The changes were small, almost imperceptible, but they accumulated like snow building toward an avalanche. They whispered that the Blizzard Woman had changed their king. Perhaps she had. Alara found Mira in the training yard, moving through defensive forms Marcus had taught her. The girl's movements held new confidence, strikes executed with precision that came from facing real danger and surviving. "You're getting better," Alara said softly. Mira lowered her practice sword, sweat dampening her hair despite the cold. "I won't be helpless again, Mama. When they came for Rowan, I couldn't move, couldn't fight. Never again." Alara embraced her fierce daughter, marveling at how much the child had grown in mere weeks. Not in height, but in the hardness around her eyes, the set of her jaw. The blizzard had stolen some innocence. The rebellion had taken more. But Mira was alive. They all were. Jonas she found in the library, reading aloud to the direwolf, which listened with patient amber eyes. The boy had attached himself to the beast and to Sir Aldrin, following them like a shadow, learning by observation what it meant to serve something larger than oneself. The wolf likes stories about knights, Jonas informed her seriously, especially the ones where they win. "Don't we all?" Alara murmured. Rowan remained the strangest mystery. The baby seemed unnaturally calm now, watching the world with eyes too knowing for an infant. When Alara carried her past the fortress's magical wards and protections, Rowan would reach out, and the ancient spells would pulse in response, recognizing something in her blood. The prophecy child, growing stronger with each passing day. Valor found Alara on the same balcony where she'd demanded training weeks ago. Snow fell soft as whispered secrets, blanketing the world in white. "Do you regret it?" he asked without preamble. "That night in the storm when you took my hand?" Alara considered the question seriously. "I regret that my children had to witness violence, that they'll carry those scars forever." She turned to face him. "But regret accepting your help?"
No.
"We'd be dead otherwise. Frozen in that blizzard, forgotten by everyone except the wolves that would have scattered our bones. You might have found shelter elsewhere. A village, a monastery." "Stop," she interrupted gently. "You're not responsible for what others chose to do. Casimir made his choices. The conspirators made theirs." She stepped closer, close enough to see the guilt etched into immortal features. "You're wondering if loving me, if caring for my children, dooms us to endless danger." His silence was answer enough. "Perhaps it does," Alara continued. "Perhaps the prophecy will bring more blood, more rebellion, more nights of terror. But I've learned something these past weeks." She touched the pendant at her throat, Seraphine's pendant, now hers. "Safety is an illusion. My husband's family should have been safe. They cast us out anyway. The blizzard should have killed us. You appeared instead. The assassins should have taken Rowan. I stopped them. Because you're stronger than you knew," Valor said quietly. "Because I had reason to be strong." Alara held his gaze. "You gave me that. Training, yes. Protection, yes. But more than that, you gave me purpose.
Choice.
The chance to become something more than widow or victim." Valor's hand lifted, hesitated, then gently cupped her face. His touch was cold as marble, yet somehow tender. "I loved Seraphine for a decade. I've mourned her for 8 centuries. I never thought," his voice caught. "I never imagined I'd feel this again. This terror and hope and desperate wanting." "I'm not her," Alara whispered. "No," he agreed. "You're yourself. Fierce and stubborn and mortal," and he stopped, searching for words across 800 years of vocabulary. and vital in ways that make me remember what it was to be young enough to feel. The snow fell. The moment stretched between them, fragile as new ice. Then Valor knelt. The gesture shocked her more than anything else had. A king, centuries old, kneeling before a widow who'd been thrown away like refuse weeks ago. "I offer you a choice," he said formally, words carrying the weight of ritual. "Remain here as my protected guests, safe and honored, but separate from the crown. Or leave with my resources, gold and guards enough to build new lives far from vampire politics." He paused, crimson eyes burning up at her. "Or stand beside me as queen in all but name, as the mother guiding the prophesied child, as my partner in reshaping what this realm might become." Alara's breath caught. She thought of that night in the blizzard, stumbling through snow with death at her heels. At that moment, Valor had appeared like a nightmare and offered salvation.
Come with me.
3 words that had changed everything. "I was abandoned in the snow," she said slowly, "by people who should have loved me. I walked toward death because I had nowhere else to walk. And you, monster, king, immortal predator, you saw me and offered mercy when you had no reason to." Tears burned her eyes. "These weeks I've learned to fight. Learned court politics. I learned that I'm descended from a queen I never knew existed. But most of all, I've learned that safety isn't hiding from destiny. It's facing it with people worth standing beside." She knelt, meeting him at eye level. "I choose to stay," Alara whispered. "Not because I'm afraid to leave. Not because I have nowhere else to go. But because I believe, no, I know, that together we can build something better. For my children. For your people. For the future the prophecy promises." Valor's hand found hers, cold fingers interweaving with warmth. "Then let it be witnessed," he said. They held the ceremony 3 nights later in the Great Hall, under silver fire chandeliers that cast no shadows. Not a wedding. Alara was still legally married in mortal law until certain paperwork caught up with reality, but a binding nonetheless. A vow before the assembled court that she stood under his protection, beside his throne, as voice for the prophesied child and advocate for all mortals in his realm. Sir Aldrin stood witness. Helene wept openly. The children watched with wide eyes as their mother became something unprecedented in vampire history. Not quite a queen, not quite consort. Something new that had no name yet. Outside, snow fell thick enough to bury the world. But inside the fortress, warmth radiated from hearths and hearts that had learned, slowly and painfully, to beat in rhythm again. Alara stood beside Valor as nobles swore oaths of fealty, and she felt the pendant pulse against her chest, Seraphine's magic recognizing this moment's weight. "It's not over," Valor murmured, voice too low for others to hear. "The external bloodhouses will challenge this. The human kingdoms will have opinions. The prophecy still hangs over us all." "I know," Alara replied, "but we'll face it together." His lips curved into something that was almost a smile.
Together.
The words settled between them like a promise carved in stone. Later, when the ceremony concluded and the nobles dispersed, Alara stood at the window with Rowan in her arms, watching snow blanket the mountains. Mira and Jonas slept peacefully in the adjoining chambers. The dire wolf curled at the door, guardian eternal. And beside her stood the vampire king, who'd found them dying in a blizzard and offered 3 words that became everything.
Come with me.
She had. And in coming had found not just survival, but purpose. Not just shelter, but home. Not just protection, but partnership. The prophecies still waited, patient as winter. Enemies still plotted in distant halls. The future remained uncertain as morning mist. But tonight, in the fortress of night and fire, the widow and her children were no longer abandoned. They were exactly where they belonged. And whatever came next, they would face it as they'd faced the blizzard, together, unbroken, and refusing to surrender to the dark. The snow fell, the fire burned, and destiny, for once, could wait until dawn.